5 O'Clock Charlie, written by Marguerite Henry. Charlie was a big old workhorse with sad brown eyes and shaggy feathers on his feet. He belonged to Mr. Spinks, a lean, weathered man with a fringe of yellow whiskers that almost matched Charlie's mane. They both lived at Tulip Hill Farm in Shropshire, England. Mr. Spinks, and everyone else, thought Charlie was too old to work. Everyone, that is, except Charlie. He had reached the great age of 28, but in spite of his years and his dignity, he could still roll over. Not just halfway, but a complete once-over. It was tremendous to behold. And when his rheumatism didn't bother him, he kicked and capered like any frisky colt. Mr. Spinks was a tough yet tender man. He thought a lot of Charlie, who had been a strong puller in his day, so he retired him and gave him a field all to himself, with a nice rain barrel for drinking water. Of course, it was a small field, and nothing much would grow on it anyway. Nothing but nasty thistles and chickweed. Charlie despised them both. One was too prickly, the other too bitter. Quite regularly, Mr. Spinks managed to bring him a wisp of hay. But even so, Charlie grew hungry and bored with life. He felt so useless. He missed the busyness of the old days, the plowing and planting, the logging and hauling, the raking and reaping. And he had nowhere at all to go. Not to the mill house to grind the grain, nor to the greengrocer's to deliver parsnips and peas and potatoes, nor to the blacksmith for a new set of shoes. Not even to the old Boar's Head Inn on Cowcross Road. Perhaps what happened at the Boar's Head was what he missed most of all. Charlie remembered how every afternoon, at the stroke of 5, Bertie would appear. She was not a bird at all. She was a plump-chested cook in a white apron. She would bounce out of the inn like a cuckoo from a clock. Then she would pull a stout rope beside the door, which set a bell to ringing. This meant that the apple tarts were nicely browned and ready to come out of the oven. Quick as flies, the people would come swarming. There were teamsters and tailors, carpenters and cobblers, bankers and barristers, goldsmiths, silversmiths, and blacksmiths. They came afoot, they came on wagons, they came in fine carriages. In the courtyard they separated. Some went indoors, and the others gathered at the swing-out, swing-in window to the kitchen. Mr. Spinks was one who went inside. He enjoyed a bumper of punch with his apple tart. Charlie was always left standing at the hitching rail with the lines wrapped loosely around it. He towered above the elegant little hackneys and the workaday cobs. The moment Mr. Spinks disappeared, Charlie used to pull the lines free and lumber over to the swing-in, swing-out window. There he would wait politely while the two-legged creatures were served. They all slapped him affectionately on the rump as they went back to their carts and carriages. Then at last it would be Charlie's turn. His nostrils would flutter in excitement as Bertie held out the flat of her hand. On it there was always a beautiful apple tart, oozing with juices that smelled of sugar and spices. "Charlie, you rascal," she would exclaim. "Now you get back to the hitching rail and do your eating there. I don't want you slobbering all over my clean window." When Mr. Spinks finally came out, wiping his whiskers on his sleeve, he never seemed to notice that Charlie's lines were no longer wrapped about the rail. He just hooked him up, climbed onto the seat of the wagon, gave a cluck-cluck to Charlie, and off they would go, home to Tulip Hill. In his retirement, Charlie sadly missed this 5 o'clock treat. He felt hungry and forlorn in his silent field, with only the grasshoppers thrumming their wings together, and a woodpecker drilling holes in an old dead tree. Morning, noon, and night were all alike. It was a world of nothing but weeds and sky. Day by day his head drooped lower, and his tail hung limp as an old rope. A month dragged by. Then one late afternoon, a curious thing happened. Charlie was aroused from his daydreaming by the wind. It was blowing sharply, bringing city smells and city sounds. He lifted his head, and suddenly the time clock in his mind began ringing. It was as if he heard a bell. He had to answer it. He trotted across the field, around the old dead tree, past the water barrel, faster and faster, until he broke into a gallop. He was heading straight for the fence. He was going to jump it. With all his strength and power, he collected his great bulk and flung himself up and over. But he was traveling too fast. His forefeet struck the top rail, smashing it to bits. He didn't even feel or hear the crash. He was over. He was free. In a burst, he was down the lane and out upon the pike, galumping toward the village. His feathers swished, his hoofs clanked, calup, calup, calippity-clop. Stately and bold and full of purpose, he trotted gaily around the bend, down through a gap in the hills, past the old steepled church, and into Cowcross Road. It was just like the old days. There was the friendly Boar's Head Inn and the same jolly people gathering at the window. They seemed delighted to see him, and thumped him more affectionately than ever. "Let's give first place to Charlie," one said, and they all bowed and made way for him. When he reached the swing-out, swing-in window, he bunted it with his nose and came face to face with Bertie. She almost dropped the plate of apple tarts. "Charlie!" she cried. "Charlie! Charlie!" And she reached up and kissed him on his nose. Then she chose the biggest, brownest, juiciest tart of all for him, and she let him eat it right there at the window. It was better than old times. There was no waiting in line and no wagon to pull. Charlie hadn't been so happy in weeks. He trumpeted his joy to the people. Then, with a snort of greeting to the unfortunate horses tied at the rail, he galumped back home at an easy gait, the feathers on his feet swinging in the little breeze he made. He felt young and frisky again, and his loneliness vanished like a fog when the sun comes out. Each day now, he trotted to the inn and arrived a jot before 5 o'clock, and each day he bunted the swing-out, swing-in window and poked his nose into the kitchen. If the kettle was hissing and the dishes making a clatter, he let out a lusty bugle to make Bertie notice him. She always jumped and grabbed herself as if an icicle had dropped down her bosom. "Lord love a duck!" she exclaimed. "It must be time to ring the bell. Whatever would I do without you, Charlie?" And she bounced out of the inn like the cuckoo from the clock. And soon the bell was binging and bonging, and farmers' wagons were pulling up, and fine carriages were all about, and people were swarming into the inn for their apple tarts and tea. Slowly, a beautiful thing was happening to Charlie. Bertie began depending more and more on him to remind her when it was tea time. He became her alarm clock. Then something even more wonderful happened. She taught him how to take the rope between his big yellow teeth and ring the bell himself. At last he had something important to do, every day, rain or shine, summer or winter. Of course, Mr. Spinks heard about these daily jaunts. The news traveled to Tulip Hill and well beyond, and one afternoon, as he was sauntering into the Boar's Head, he caught sight of Charlie, large as life, over at the window. He fancied for a moment the thought of speaking to Charlie, but he couldn't quite bring himself to do it. He just gave a wink in his direction. Then, chuckling, he quickly turned his head, pretending not to see. It was a kind of secret shared. In the course of time, Mr. Spinks's wife noticed the broken fence rail. "Land sakes alive!" she exclaimed. "Will you look at what that good-for-nothing Charlie has done? Mind you mend that fence at once," she scolded Mr. Spinks. In fact, she had to scold him again and again. Each time he would scratch his head thoughtfully and then reply in the same way. "Quite right, my dear. Someday I'll fix it." But he never did. The end.